Good afternoon. My name is Siviwe Mhlana, and I'm a researcher here at the Southern Center for Inequality Studies. And it is my honor to present to you the first session of the Promoting Intersectional Development Research Learning Series, a collaboration with Canada's International Development Research Center and the University of the Witwatersrand Southern Center for Inequality Studies. In 2023, SEIS, in collaboration with Canada's IDRC and researchers across the Global South, undertook a study to understand intersectionality and its relevance in Global South context. The project resulted in 8 case study reports, which illustrated the diverse application of intersectional approaches in multiple countries across the Global South. Now, the Promoting Intersectional Development Research Learning Series is an opportunity to learn and share knowledge about the opportunities and challenges for integrating intersectionality in development research in order to address persistent inequalities around the world. This first learning session, titled Intersectionality and Inequality, Critical Reflections from the Global South, aims to examine intersectionality and its potential for imagining a fairer and more just future in the context of developing countries in the Global South. In order to address this objective, this learning session will attempt to answer the following questions. What is intersectionality? How has intersectionality emerged in the Global South? How can intersectionality contribute to social change? What are the challenges for integrating intersectionality in development research? What are the risks of not including intersectionality in development research and policy? And finally, the session will conclude with some practical and programmatic recommendations for donors and researchers seeking to integrate intersectionality in their work. It is my pleasure to welcome our speakers for this session. Dr. Ingrid Lynch is a Chief Research Specialist in the Public Health Societies and Belonging Division at the Human Sciences Research Council. Previously, she led the Research Advocacy and Policy Program at Triangle Project, an LGBTQI+ human rights organization. Her work centers on gender and sexuality studies, with a particular focus on Eastern and Southern Africa and other Global South contexts. She is passionate about intersectional feminist and participatory approaches to developing solutions for sustainable and equitable social change. Prof. Relebogile Moletsane is a professor and the G.L. Dube Chair in Rural Education in the School of Education and the Pro-Vice Chancellor for Social Cohesion at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. Using participatory visual methodology, her research focuses on rural education and development, girlhood studies, gender-based violence, and sexual and reproductive health and rights in South African rural schools and communities. Prof. Moletsane's current projects involve working with rural communities and schools to understand and address gender-based violence. Dr. Lisa Weaversick is the research manager of the Center for Visual Methodologies for Social Change at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. Her work focuses on girlhood, gender, and sexuality, comprehensive sexuality education, rurality, and participatory visual methodology. And finally, our very own Dr. Ujithra Punaya is a senior researcher at the Southern Center for Inequality Studies. She works with the Wealth Inequalities and Elites research stream at SEIS, and her research interests include economic elites, caste, race, and gender in India and South Africa. Her research in India unpacks how a business caste called Agarwals reproduces in Delhi with a focus on the gender question. In South Africa, she's researched property elites, landowners, and property developers involved in the making of a waterfall city. Currently, she is also a co-PI on an ESRC project titled Transnational Elites and the Reproduction of Inequalities in Mumbai, Johannesburg, and London. I now hand over to our first speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Siviwe, and good day, everybody. It is really lovely to be part of this panel today, and I'm excited to hear also from the other panelists. I'm going to kick us off. I think I'll just jump right in. First sharing my slides. There we go. Okay. Looks like it's popped up there. Thank you. So I'm going to start, like I said, just jump right in. I think what I initially had as sort of my task in terms of setting us up for the discussion, I was going to start with, what is intersectionality? What are some of the main tenets of intersectionality? And then I was going to bring it into conversation with development research and policy making. And then I was going to end off with how to do intersectional development research. And of course, as I started thinking about this more carefully, I realized that that was not really going to work. And I thought I would rather start first with what are we getting wrong in development research? Why do we even need to think about bringing in other frameworks and lenses into our research and policy making? There are lots of different critical theory lenses and different methodologies that have emerged to help us do better at development research. And intersectionality is one of many. And I think we don't necessarily want to be in a position where we adopt something because it is suddenly a buzzword in development research, in critical theory research more broadly, but actually want to be quite thoughtful and intentional in terms of what it has to offer to our work. And then in terms of operationalizing intersectionality research, I decided to be more realistic and focus on 3 principles that I've found helpful when doing intersectionality research or when integrating an intersectional lens into my research. So that is what I'll be going through. And as I said, I want us to start off thinking about what it is that we are perhaps not getting right in development research. And this author, Marissa Teixeira Luna, has a really helpful guide if you want to consider development research more broadly and also look at perhaps some decolonial perspectives. And as she says, they're a ridiculously simplified guide to intersectional and decolonial research with examples. So I definitely encourage you to go and look at that. So she's a scholar and an activist, and she points out how in the development sector, we often approach, define and respond to development challenges as if they are unanticipated, novel, exceptional. We label them as humanitarian crises or ecological crises and situations, and we respond to them with often short-term solutions because of how we tend to frame these issues. So I think one of the ways that we can try to counter that and help ourselves to deepen our thinking is to look at a lens that is not ahistorical, that considers these crises in their context and actually tries to help us understand the root causes of these quote unquote crises as they manifest in that context. So I am arguing that intersectionality is one such lens that can help us to do that. If we consider another critique of development research, this is another book that I've found really helpful to help me think through some of the ways that we can do development research better or do research in support of development better. And in the introduction to this book, the authors state that studying development today often translates into studying crises caused by development processes. And those responsible for causing development problems remain in charge of solving them. I think that does not only go for international actors. I think we can all recognize how we are also part of framing the problems and part of framing the responses to those problems. And I think what this really highlights is that we also need a lens that helps us understand power in its complexity and how we, in terms of responding to development challenges are also embedded within those power systems. And it is really helpful to have a more nuanced understanding of how power operates. And then I'm going to just highlight one last critique of development research. And here I want us to consider the indicators and the different measurements that we've been developing over time and using sometimes quite uncritically to measure our progress towards achieving, I think, most prominently the Sustainable Development Goals, I think, has been shaping our thinking and really channeling funding for development research significantly. And this, again, from this book, from the introduction to this book, the authors are saying there that dataism has emerged as a new currency. If knowledge is no longer a combination of the multiplicity of experiences, it is part of the problem rather than the solution. And I want us to just take a moment to consider what this means a bit more practically. I mentioned that the Sustainable Development Goals is a framework that has, and I'm not necessarily criticizing the framework, I'm focusing on how we do research, is a framework that has really been channeling how we frame development issues and how we frame how we're meant to be responding to those issues. And this is the findings of a bibliometric analysis that these authors did. They looked at research done on the SDGs, journal articles, and they analyzed the extent to which these publications include a sex and or gender perspective. And you don't necessarily need to go through these in detail, but you can see that, of course, SDG 5, which is focused on gender equality, has 95% of those publications refer to gender. I'm intrigued why it's not 100%. And then, I mean, we have, I would argue, consensus that gender inequality really influences the achievement of all SDGs. And yet we have goal number 1 that is aimed at ending poverty. We only have 25% of those research articles focused on that goal, referring to gender or engaging gender. I can lift out one more. SDG 8, decent work and economic growth. The research conducted there, only 8% of those publications actually engage gender. So our development research is largely gender blind. It's largely not engaging the complexity of social experiences and the systems within which we find ourselves that create development challenges. So I think this point on dataism is really profound. And for me, it really, it invites us to identify a lens or lenses that can help us consider how people are located in these multiple interlocking systems of oppression based on their particular identities and experiences. And intersectionality, I think, once one digs into the theory a bit, would argue that that might be gender. It might also be other identities and experiences that overlap and in different ways shape oppression and disadvantage. So having pointed out where we're failing, that is always a fun moment, right? To pause and consider where we're doing things wrong. I want us to then look at what intersectionality can offer. I started hinting at that through those 3 ideas. So what does intersectionality offer us in terms of perhaps doing better at development research, whether we're funding that research or conducting that research? Intersectionality, those of you familiar with that body of work that's really growing and deepening also in the Global South, it emerged as a corrective to feminist theorizing in the Global North. It was a corrective to a white feminist positionality that really definitely worked to advance women's rights, but did not do so from a position where women was considered sort of a diverse category. Women was, the category women was really seen as homogenous. So it emerged out of Black feminist theorizing and activism. Kimberly Crenshaw coined the term, but as we've, I think many of us, as soon as we dip a toe into intersectionality scholarship, realize that actually there are many global South feminisms and indigenous theories and theorists and activists that contributed to this kind of thinking. And I really like this quote by Kimberly Crenshaw. If we are going to use sort of her language in terms of framing intersectionality, she says, it helps the framework, it helps you to see where power comes and collides, where it interlocks and intersects. It's not simply that there's a race problem here, a gender problem here, and a class or LGBTQ problem there. Many times that kind of framework erases what is happening to people who are subject to all of these things. So people who live their lives at the intersection of all of these things. And I think it emphasizes that this approach is not additive. It is looking at how our different experiences and how we're located within these different systems of power that structure our lives, how these interlock and how they create very distinct experiences for us. And this could be an experience of disadvantage. It can also be an experience of advantage. So I think we often forget the latter, that along with our positioning sometimes comes privilege, and in other settings that might translate into disadvantage. I want to also just break down, I think, 2 points that are often highlighted when people talk about intersectionality as a helpful lens. The first is that it helps bring attention to important differences within population groups that are often portrayed as relatively homogeneous. So I was speaking about that when I talked about the roots of this theory really being a corrective against that. So we have a tendency to think in these categories and often binary categories. So we see these groups as homogeneous, like I said. So women, men, migrants, indigenous people, other groups that are in different ways made vulnerable and put at risk. And this gives us an understanding that women, for example, that their experiences are all the same. But once we apply this lens, it's possible to see how, if we use one example, still sticking to race and gender, how a white woman from a lower socioeconomic group might be penalized for her gender and class when accessing, for example, certain services like health and social care, but she has the relative advantage of race over a Black woman. So these different aspects inform each other and are not experienced separately. This is Elena Henkowski and colleagues who presented that particular framing of intersectionality. And then they continue to say that it sheds light on the fact that individual and group inequities are shaped by these interactions between multiple sites and levels of power. And I think it's depicted quite well within this visual. So having highlighted those 2 tenets, I think one way to consider this at its core is that this is a lens that helps us understand not only who is left behind with greater specificity than when we just adopt these single axis lenses, but also why and how. And that is the part that is sometimes minimized, that once we've identified who is left behind and why and how, we also then need to be compelled to act to address those inequalities. I'm going to then go to the final section of my inputs to look at, I indicated that I'll highlight 3 helpful principles when doing intersectionality research. I think one of the things that is really emphasized so often is that it is difficult to do this work. It's demanding. It requires us to think in a different way. And I think that can be paralyzing. I think it can cause us to get caught up in the complexity as if it's a barrier. But I think if you're a researcher who is curious about understanding the world and using those insights to change the world, I think, yes, it's daunting, but that is what we do, right? We try to do better and we try to use frameworks that help us with that difficult task. So the first thing I wanted to highlight is that it's important to situate our methods in context and to avoid intersectionality fade. Many of the frameworks that we've been adopting in research, I think, tries to bring in intersectionality. I'm thinking of the kinds of funding guidelines that we often receive when we're applying for grants, where initially we were encouraged to include gender in our analyses, and increasingly we're encouraged to use intersectionality as a lens as well. And what can happen is that we apply that quite carefully at inception. We write our problem statement. We try to outline how these different, as I was describing earlier, intersecting identities and systems of power shape the problem that we're researching. But we do not necessarily take it through across all stages in our research. So I think that's a helpful point to keep in mind, that we need to be applying that lens throughout every stage of our research. And I think another reason why we don't always do this is that we don't necessarily build researcher capacity. Again, I think funders have an obligation here to build into grants the opportunity for people to build their skills and also their confidence in applying critical social theory lenses, including intersectionality. We don't also include sufficient time and funding for the activities. If you consider situating your methods in context, what does that mean? It means that you have to engage with your context, right? You're going to have community engagement, or you're going to have a participatory process. You're going to have to include something that helps you go from just the literature to also understanding the setting in a more meaningful way. The second point I wanted to highlight here is that I think something, again, that trips us up when we try to use an intersectionality lens is that we struggle with identifying which of those very many social categories to include in our analysis. So yes, we understand this needs to go beyond a single axis analysis. We can't stop at gender, for example, or stop at race, or stop at class. We need to consider these different identities and experiences as they intersect. But how do we do that? And I think a helpful anchor point to use is to consider your research question. What is it that you want to generate intersectional insights on? And as a second point there, to consider how communities themselves define the important aspects of their lives and their realities. So that brings in not only questions of rigor, but also ethics, whether you're engaging with people living the issues that you're wanting to study, and how do they themselves self-identify and consider the aspects of the experiences that are important. And then the last point, valuing methodological plurality. Again, if you look at intersectionality scholarship, it's easy to think that your research has to be participatory, it has to be qualitative, that there are particular ways of doing intersectionality research that can be considered a gold standard. And I think that sometimes can limit the potential for intersectionality to shape our research in really powerful ways. And again, a good anchor, I think, there is to consider which methods will generate intersectional insights in your study. And that may or may not be qualitative methodologies. It may or may not be participatory methodologies. And I think this is especially important if we want to look at those subject areas and disciplines where we have historically not been looking at social complexity and at power and at the structural drivers of risk and vulnerability. And we see that in quantitative research, to just state it explicitly. And we see that often in the kind of subject areas that have more to do with natural sciences and still suffer from those legacies of positivism and so-called neutrality and objectivity. So in that sense, I think it's worth thinking about other ways in which to integrate intersectional analyses. And there are resources emerging that look at quantitative approaches to that. I'm going to stop there I was saying before we started that I really want to stick to my time because I know that we want to have time for discussion. So I'll leave you with that. I'm going to hand back over to Siviwe so that we can hear from the other panelists. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dr. Ingrid Lynch. I think you've given us a good starting point for kind of understanding how intersectionality helps us to understand, I think, as you put it, like systems of power and oppression, and how to see the world so that we're able to kind of develop kind of the research that will help us, once we've seen it, to change and also to measure it. I think from kind of your initial remarks around how we measure progress. So I'm just going to hand over then now, and thank you for sticking to the time. I'm going to hand over now to Prof. Relebohile Moletsane and Dr. Lisa Weaversick from the University of KwaZulu-Natal, who will be giving some inputs around kind of the opportunities and challenges that intersectionality brings in terms of helping us to address these persistent inequalities around the world, and more kind of specifically from the perspective and experiences in the global south.
Good afternoon, everybody. We are Lisa Weaversick and Relebohile Moletsane. Lisa will introduce herself shortly. I'm Relebohile Moletsane. And we are at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, as has been said. Can you move the slide, Lisa? And we, the two of us work from the Center for Visual Methodologies for Social Change. Our presentation today will, I see Lisa has moved the slide, so it doesn't matter anymore. You'll see what we will, our agenda has. So our work at the Center for Visual Methodologies for Social Change has, over the years, focused on gender-based violence in rural areas, mostly. And what we have focused on is working with girls, but also with young women and older women in rural communities. So those are the first three bullets are three examples of projects we just completed with partners in the global north. And we just wanted to highlight the reality of the funding situation for us in the global south, that always we have to collaborate with partners in the global north. And often that poses particular issues, such, shall we say, but also advantages that we can tap into. Our newest problem is working with youth in 6 countries, and South Africa is one of 6 countries in the global south. India is one of them. Mexico is another one, and I can't remember which ones, but it's one of, South Africa is one of 6. So those are the kinds of work we do as the Center for Visual Methodologies for Social Change. So that's who we are. I'll hand over to Lisa to start us off with the presentation for today.
Good afternoon, everybody. So we're going to take a really quick look at international development specifically, and relate that hopefully to the work that we do. So from our perspective as girlhood scholars, often, in and from the global South, scholars like those that are listed on the slide, they have drawn attention to kind of the problematic history of international development. It's been shaped since its beginning by the legacies of colonialism and the rise and dominance of neoliberal ideology, politics and economics. And so the argument is that international development has been very much shaped by the context in which it was developed, which was characterized by what Kopana Wilson has described as the reconfiguration of imperialism after formal colonialism, the perceived threat posed to capitalism and the unequal distribution of wealth, especially by communism during the Cold War era, and the neoliberal turn in global politics and economics in the 1970s. And as neoliberalism, along with the rise of neoliberalism, there was the development of international development, and you can track the rise of neoliberalism through international development discourse and policy. So while international development is still often framed as something that is neutral, apolitical, and ahistorical, this framing masks the ongoing influence of colonial thinking and neoliberalism. And it obscures the economic and political motivations that are often behind development policy and practice, and which serve to maintain and perpetuate unequal social, political, and economic power relations between the global North and the global South. So among the critiques of international development is included a focus on the race, class, and gendered values and assumptions that are linked to colonialism and neoliberalism that we see coming through in international development discourse. So these relationships, as Wilson refers to them, they structure the flow of knowledge and policy from the global North to the global South, and the flow of wealth from the global South to the global North. And so international development and international development discourse is implicated in the reproduction of colonialist dichotomies and ideologies and the maintenance of unequal global power relations. There are risks associated with an uncritical engagement in development research or policy or programming. And these include gender and cultural essentialism, saviorism, jargon, and buzzwords, as Ingrid also referred to, and a poor fit between interventions and programming and the real lived experiences of the people who the interventions are intended to aid. So we see this by looking at an example. We work in girlhood studies a lot, so of particular interest to us has been the girling of development, as Hayhurst has described sort of the shift in international development during the last 2 or so decades to a focus on girls. And this move has been part of the evolution of the smart economics approach in international development. And that can be seen in many texts, but like an example is the statement by Jim Yong Kim, the former president of the World Bank Group, when he said, "There is no question the biggest bang for the buck in development is girls' education." So international development discourse has been very effectively critiqued for its construction of the third world girl as racialized, poor, rural, perpetually, inevitably, and homogeneously vulnerable, unagentic, and powerless. Lee Gilmore and Elizabeth Marshall put it particularly well when they observed that it often seems that girlhood has congealed into a single sad story in which imperiled girls await rescue with limited hope or success. As we've argued in a chapter that's currently in press, we take issue with this construction or this single story of girlhood in the Global South for, among others, two particular reasons. First, as Emily Bent has pointed out, this construction or narrative problematically reinscribes colonialist divides between Western and Third World girlhoods that reify the dichotomies of Western empowerment and Third World vulnerability. Second, this construction of girls in the Global South as perpetually and inevitably and homogeneously vulnerable and unagentic and waiting for rescue doesn't align with our experience and that of others who are doing work in communities with girls. And one of the dangers of the dominance of international development discourse, and it has to do with also funding and all of those things, is that it seems to have been imported in some ways in South Africa anyway. And, you know, there are pitfalls associated with the uncritical adoption of imported development paradigms and discourses that fail to take into account and respond to the historical and the current political, social, and economic contexts in which international development is practiced. So it seems like these discourses have been, at least to some extent, imported into South Africa, and it's influenced how Black South African girls are positioned in relation to agency, vulnerability, and risk, and it has also influenced the interventions designed to help them. So the example that we're using today is the Zazi campaign, which we are still coming across in some of the communities that we work in. The campaign, briefly, is an advocacy, mass media, and community mobilization campaign, which was delivered through, among other things, a song called Zazi, which was written and performed by a South African musician and a South African poet. And the lyrics of the song really emphasize the importance of girls knowing and loving themselves and making good choices. And the music video depicts examples of young women drawing on their strength to make decisions for their own future. And although the Zazi campaign includes local actors, like the Department of Health and the Department of Social Development, like campaigns and programs designed and implemented by large international development organizations, the Zazi campaign and others like it position girls and young women as simultaneously vulnerable, agentic, and in need of rescue, and responsible for saving themselves and their communities by making the kind of good choices they learn about in these programs. Oops. And so, although the campaign materials and statements made by those involved recognize that the needs of girls and young women can't be understood without taking into consideration contextual factors that influence their decision-making, they do just that. They focus heavily on the inner resources and strengths of girls who, it seems, need only know themselves to be able to overcome the not insignificant challenges they face, including poverty, moral panic, and taboos around adolescent sexuality, gender inequality and gender-based violence, and a lack of access to adequate sexual and reproductive health information and care. So we are going to reflect now on some of our experiences in the field. So very briefly, some context. This project, Profitable, had it on a slide earlier on. It took place between 2014 and 2021. It was called the Networks for Change for short. It's a very long title, actually, as usual. And we were working in and with a rural community in the Drakensberg region of KwaZulu-Natal. And we worked with a group of 15 girls and young women. And they were all aged between 15 and 19 years old. And the group named themselves the Social Ills Fighters. And we worked together from October 2016 until 2021 officially anyway. So in our very first workshop, the social ills fighters identified early and forced marriage as a key issue affecting the health and safety and well-being of girls and young women. So while we had gone into the community with several assumptions, conscious or unconscious, we weren't aware that early and forced marriage was a big issue in this community or an issue at all. And neither was our community partner. And the girls, the social ills fighters, were really insistent that this be the issue that we focus on in our work together. So far from being vulnerable and passive and unagentic, the social ills fighters, through their visual artifacts and through the participatory visual methodology processes, we're at the Center for Visual Methodologies, we most often use participatory visual methodology. Through these artifacts and processes, the social ills fighters were able to offer really nuanced analyses of their own communities, and they were able to clearly identify and articulate the challenges that they face. They set the research agenda. Their analyses also, independent of us, included how an understanding of how the intersections of poverty, gender, and ideas about culture and tradition shape their lives and experiences and constrain their agency. In their narratives and in our work together, the girls constructed themselves and positioned themselves as agentic subjects in their own lives. And they also offered challenge and resistance to entrenched social norms and expectations. So this is an example, one example of several, just in our own work, of how the way that girls are constructed in international development discourse and the way that girls live their lives aren't necessarily aligned, and resulting in kind of a poor fit between what the needs are and the lived experiences of the girls and the policy and programming and interventions. So we were able to engage in a process of community-based policymaking. And on the right-hand side there, you can see some of the social ills fighters actually presenting some of their visual artifacts to their community in front of the Ngosi, who was involved in this whole process. And it resulted in the co-development between us at the university, various partners, and the social ills fighters and their community, including the traditional leadership. It resulted in the development of a reporting and response protocol to address early and forced marriage in this community. Unfortunately, the protocol was signed very shortly before COVID lockdown started. So that sort of created a delay in its implementation. But this goes to show that how we think about the people that we work with is really, really important, and how we include them in the processes of social change. So what can intersectionality do for us based on the reflections from our own work? So it provides us with a set of conceptual and analytical tools that can approach how we work, it influences our whole approach to research and our relationships with communities. The work that we do is very, relationships are central to the work that we do. So it enables us to develop with the people with whom we work a better understanding of the phenomenon or the issue or the challenge that we are looking at. And that includes the complex matrix of constraints and the unique kinds of agency that people have and different ways of exercising it. It keeps us aware, if we do it right, of our own assumptions and those that are integrated in sort of the mainstream thinking of our discipline or field. And it makes us aware not just of the unequal power relations and systems of oppression in our local communities and more broadly in South Africa, but also global power relations, including the global politics of knowledge. The aspect of intersectionality as critical practice is really what makes it as useful as it is in the kind of work that we do, allowing us to work with people to disrupt dominant or normative power relations, and develop more effective, responsive, and context-relevant strategies to address issues. It also is particularly useful because intersectionality aligns so well with various theories, including, particularly for our work, feminist post-colonial theory and African feminist theory. And with that, I will hand over to Lebo to talk about African feminist theory and intersectionality.
Yes, so when we started taking our work, making our work public, taking it to conferences, and using intersectionality as a lens. I don't know whether other people from the global south have experienced this. We experienced a little bit of a pushback with people asking us why we insist on using theoretical lenses from the north when we could be using theoretical lenses from the south. So we began looking into the utility of intersectionality as a theory that has been used in the South. Fortunately for me, it was at the time that Lisa was doing her PhD, so I could bully her into doing a lot of the reading. And so we started with post-colonial theory, and went on into Southern theory. That's when we came across the work of Rewin Cornell and Rob Morrell at UCT and so on. Rewin Cornell, who pointed out that, and I quote, colonized and peripheral societies produce social thought about the modern world, which has as much intellectual power as what has been thought of as metropolitan social thought. So basing our starting point from there, then we began to look for African-based researchers who have theorized around gender and around other social issues in the South. Next slide, Lisa. Yes. So I, in the interest of time, and I know we have eaten into our time a lot. So using Southern theory as our base, I think all I need to say for now is that what Rewin Cornell helped us think about was valuing the knowledge from the South as much as we had been valuing knowledge in the North, and challenging the dominance of knowledge production from the North, European and North American centered knowledge production. Next slide, Lisa. And so we started coming south and reading African feminism. And actually we discovered that as long ago as at the early 2000s, in fact, even before that, African feminists have been using intersectionality in their work because of the complexity of the issues that we have to deal with on the African continent. Just by the sheer complexity of the issues that we have to deal with. What disrupted our use of intersectionality, and South Africa being one stark example, was during the struggle for independence, where we were told actually the gender struggle disrupts the struggle for independence. So hold on that until we get racial independence. Then you can go back to your gender struggle. That was the only disruption. And by the time we got back to that, maybe it was too late, which is why we are in this mess today. And so in most post-colonial states, having prioritized in independence, gender inequality, and other, as it intersects with other systems of power, has sort of run amok in those states. Thank you, Lisa. So just to conclude by saying, in the African context, because of the complexity, as I've said, of the issues that we have to deal with, an intersectional feminist analysis help us center the issues that may remain hidden if we don't surface them through an analysis that looks at the intersecting systems of power that affect people in communities that we may not have looked at, like the early marriages that we hadn't intended to look at in the community that Lisa talked about earlier on. And if you are interested and you haven't done so, we just identified the African feminist writers that we have read and that you might find interesting to look at, who have used intersectionality as their lens in their work. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Prof. Relebohile Moletsane and Dr. Lisa Wiebesek. I think your inputs actually kind of tie in very well with the first session, right? Where we kind of looking at, systems of power and oppression more broadly, but I think the kind of your presentation and the case study that you've also presented shows how that is not only happening at kind of a local or community level, but I think what you're both highlighting here is that it's happening in the kind of international development space, but also in how kind of knowledge is presented. So the same people who kind of have shaped kind of the narrative, which has brought us here, continue to shape, how we kind of understand and look into these questions. And I think you mentioned the criticism as well about, why don't we look at, African theories and such. I think the other criticism that comes up oftentimes is, we've been dealing with these issues, right? Our context, our colonial context, our apartheid history in the South African case, has always forced us to kind of see the world with, as it is, right? With these issues of kind of the context being important, the kind of historical and structural issues being important. But I think what you're raising here with this presentation as well is using these lenses such as intersectionality offers us an opportunity to disrupt, but also to kind of shape those narratives and the policies that we're kind of developing to change these kind of inequalities that we're dealing with. So with that, then I think I want to hand over to Dr. Ujithra Ponia from SCIS, who is our discussant for this session today.
Thank you, Siviwe. Thank you, colleagues, for extremely rich presentations. And there's so much food for thought here. I have 10 minutes, so let me try and pull together some strings that I see that overlap between both your presentations and maybe end with a couple of questions for us to think through. It's interesting, right? We have a theory which is getting coined in the US from the legal system because Kimberly Crenshaw identifies that experiences of Black women are just falling through the cracks. And this theory then travels to us in India, it comes to us in South Africa. And it's an important footnote here, as Siviwe and Prof have mentioned, that in the South African context, these struggles have preceded the spread or the buzzword that intersectionality has now become, at least in the development research space, right? This fact that, while the struggle for liberation was going on, the fight was forefronted. The 1956 march that happens, the Women's March Against the Past Laws, where women are coming out in numbers. I mean, gender and race is getting forefronted. So we didn't necessarily need intersectionality in South Africa, but it's great to have a term that can be shared across in the global context while being aware of the kind of politics through which it travels to us, the kind of funding that you highlighted, and suddenly them realizing that one needs to start focusing on race along with gender, right? And in that context where, development research and international development comes to us in this context of trying to think of newer strategies of neocolonialism, how do we then engage with identity in ways in which that it doesn't collapse into identity politics the way we see it happen in pockets in the US, right? It's a moment for us to try and find ways of thinking about identity which is meaningful, which resonates with people on the ground. And the value of this framework, as your rich research shows, is that it draws on experiences. And feminist theorization has always started with experiences and questioning them, unpacking them, and historicizing them, and as well as identifying the kind of power privilege that plays along multiple axes, which makes us see some things at some times and invisibilizes the other, right? And both your work and your engagement with the framework show us that. Now, when we look at, so how is it that one then thinks about doing intersectional research in the development sphere? And we are, I know with the KZN colleagues, we are in the academic centers, but I know there are a lot of people online who are interested in taking this forward in, doing development research using intersectional frameworks. How does one do it? And I think the points that, sorry, I've forgotten your first name, Ingrid Lynch mentions, the three principles I think are highly useful. You do not do an intersectionality fade, and I like that term. So you do the work of contextualizing, you do the work of historicizing. You do identify, you work with identities also by bringing in what she used to use, a term called self-identification. And I think that's really important here, especially when you're working with experiences. And I think Prof and Lisa's research also shows, international partners might not have thought about child marriages being pertinent. In India, we call it child marriages. Here, under girlhood studies, I suppose, early marriages is the term that's used. And how that's pertinent here in the context without having done that kind of field work, the legwork, and realizing what is it that is bothering these girls without somebody telling us from the top down. And I love this phrase that's come up, right? No more vows for cows. And that beautifully brings together kind of the culture, the tradition, the poverty, the assertion, the agency. While on the other hand, if you put that kind of, the video clip, that Jazzy campaign that is happening, kind of look at the way they are using it. They're using words like inner strength and good choices, which falls right into that neoliberal understanding of subjectivity and agency, which you're countering, right? By saying that it's not that. It's not just about me being strong. It's the fact that the cows are on play here. They're back grazing, our paddy fields, and how do you then contest with that? And I think that's really powerful to do that, and then also to bring in a lens of critical praxis, right? To theorize, to produce knowledge, to contest government understandings of what is happening, global understandings through the funding, but at the same time, also being able to use visual artifacts in this participatory manner. And I think that's so powerful. I think visuals speak so much louder at times than words, and to use that. So I'm very curious to look up more work that your center is doing, colleagues. And I want perhaps, how many minutes have I spoken? Okay, 5 minutes. All right, I do want to bring this point about positivism that Lynch spoke about, and the fact that how do we take this to other disciplines, right? What do you do when you're working with data sets? We're not just constituting small knowledge in global world. We were trying to theorize in such a way that from the local, one can ask questions of the macro of the data sets. So how can data sets then be unpacked? And that's something to bear in mind, because many times what happens is when they work with data, they give us kind of this abstract level of theorizing, and they send some of us foot soldiers into the field to do the qualitative work and bring back interesting stories. These are not just interesting stories. These are ways of fracturing those data sets which appear to be ossified and almost congealed and ahistorical at times, right? That's the way the data sets present themselves. And that's, I think it's a valuable point to bear in mind. And perhaps just two observations. I think so that intersectional understanding and kind of knowledge production doesn't then just become a question about race and gender or caste and gender. One also needs to think about how does it come together with questions of class. Now, there are ways of theorizing it, and both from the anti-caste scholars, Dalit scholars in India, as well as the South African feminists and the scholars that you mentioned in your slide, I know there are really interesting ways of engaging with the question of class. And I think this legwork needs to be done, because many times what happens in the kind of Marxist framings is that the race and gender question becomes at the superstructure level, and the economics becomes the base. Right? So then we are just informing the superstructure, while this economics is this abstract, again, monolith, which one has to grapple with. And of course, these are old heterodox Marxist ways of thinking. One would hope colleagues in the contemporary would do more creative work, but I think there's much for them to also learn from intersectional theorists, to read this work that's coming up from the rich experiences, to see how is it that they're engaging with this, the economics of things, or the class aspect of things. And perhaps the last point is a point of observation. From the little that I've read around intersectionality in South Africa, I have to say, and especially as looking at readings that were coming up around the Fees Must Fall protest, I felt more than scholarship in India, scholarship in South Africa seems to forefront the body. Which I particularly liked. And I thought that was a difference in the way in which intersectionality had traveled between the two countries. All right, thank you so much.
Thanks, Sujitra, for I think such a beautiful synthesis of the discussion that we're having. And I don't want to monopolize the space because I'm aware of the time. So I just want to open it up to our audience participants there with any questions that people have. I don't see any questions in the chat. Perhaps comms can also let us know if people are able to use their microphones. Okay, while we're trying to sort that out, I think for me, I think Ujithra, you're raising some important questions, and I think on this question of firstly how we integrate intersectionality in data in from the quantitative side, because I think it's the same as I think other kind of approaches, feminist approaches have kind of being introduced in the social sciences. Has always been, okay, either looking at this from, including these in qualitative sides, or including this in more kind of gender studies, as if there's no space for this, right? So we then confine these ways of kind of thinking about the world in how it actually appears, right? And the reality of the world, we kind of confine this to a separate category as if it cannot be useful in other spaces. And it reminds me actually as well about how we include communities. I think Ingrid's point earlier about, embracing different approaches, embracing kind of pluralism is particularly important. But I think from the discussion that we're having here with Prof. Lebu and Dr. Lisa here is also the importance of including, the people that are, of that community and, experiencing those issues so that they can be the ones that shape the questions that we ask and shape the kinds of policies that come into play. And it reminds me of some research that I did with where a comrade was saying, oh, well, when we come into this, and it was issues around, I think at the time, social reproductive health and rights, they were raising the issue that, oh, the community only becomes involved, as you were mentioning, when people are doing the data collection or when they have to fill up the room and become warm bodies, right? So other than that, there's no inclusion of community in the space. And I think it's particularly important to think about how we do that. And again, the issue of context that you raise as well. In the South African case, the language might not necessarily be the same, right? So communities, women in South Africa or in the global South might not express their experiences in the same way as, a feminist in the global North, right? Where it might be as clear cut as, okay, the reason I am in this experience is because I am a woman, right? Whereas it becomes a little bit more complicated when you take context with a colonial past where those issues are mostly integrated. And, depending on the struggle at the time, people might articulate that struggle using a particular identity, whether at a certain moment that becomes worker, whether at a certain moment that becomes race, because we understand, at a certain level, those are actually intersectional as their experience, right? So we know that Black women are more likely to be in low-paying jobs. So whether I'm expressing that as I'm poor because I'm Black, I'm also the class element is inherent within that, right? And the racial element is inherent within that. And I think this does kind of raise those important issues as well. I see a question in the comment in the chat here asking, how do we deepen the agenda of global South-focused research, especially with the tensions in gender constructions, understandings that differ from both these regions? I think it might be a question directed to Ingrid.
Thanks, Claudine. It's a difficult question. And I feel, and maybe you can unmute yourself, or did we establish that's not possible? Because if you are able to, it would be great if you could just maybe elaborate on that a little bit. Because what strikes me is the second part of your question, the tensions in gender constructions and understandings that differ from both these regions. I suppose global South and global North regions. I think one thing that comes to mind for me is that we do tend to impose our own understanding regardless of where we're located in the world, in the settings that we do our research. And it comes back to that point of self-identification, identification. And I think something that we've seen in research that I happen to know Claudine was also part of the team leading that, a multi-country study that's really foregrounded that we often have assumptions about homophobia, transphobia, community beliefs around gender and sexual diversity that really isolates and marginalizes LGBTIQ identified people. And we locate that in African settings as if it's rooted in being African somehow. And I think that has been a very strange thing to see play out in research when we have a very organized, what people call anti-gender movement in the global north, in the US and Europe, and really a lot of rights regressions in those settings. So my long answer is that I think we are doing quite well in the global south in researching gender and sexuality. I think often when we take that position that we're moving from the position of how communities define issues themselves. And definitely the presentation that we just heard on the study around girlhood underscored that, I think. You know, meeting with participants and seeing how they identify their identities, how they consider their own agency and the constraints on that, and their possibilities for changing any constraints on that. And I think maybe that's a lesson that the global north can sometimes take from us, if I can be that bold and say that.
Thanks. I've been informed that there are a couple of hands up, one from Novana and another one from Jocelyn. And then I see a question as well from Michelle Groenewald in the chat, which is asking if the speakers could please speak to how to tackle the universalism that is sometimes pushed from global north feminists that negates that there are many specific contributions from the global south feminists. How do we push back from the dominance, I guess, of a northern perspectives and series? Oh, there we go. I see the hands. Novana Pillay.
Hi, and thank you all for the presentations. They were really great and very thought-provoking. My question is to, mainly to Ingrid. We're talking about datafication, and I mean, I think it's such an important issue to address, and the kind of dominance of, what's become evidence-based language, and recognizing that it's important, but also recognizing the role it plays in kind of undervaluing kind of qualitative research and the stories, which as were described by the discussant as just kind of slotting between the data because it's nice to have some stories. And then towards the end of your presentation, I think you had to stop, but you started to talk about ways in which we can actually measure these ways of things, and various the intersectional aspects of inequality and the kind of structural stuff. And I don't know if you're able to elaborate a little bit more about that, because it's something I always I'm left with at the end of a paper or a discussion as a qualitative researcher, making the point that it's, we need to address all these multiple structures, but never really being sure or feeling, that point comes across strongly when it's not backed up by data, so to speak. Thank you.
Okay, I can try to respond to that, but I think there are some people who are doing good work on that, and I'll try to either paste some of those references in the chat, or otherwise I think the organizers will be able to share what I send with them in some way. I think so yes, it's about what counts as evidence especially when we do evidence-based policymaking. And we know that especially in certain highly politicized settings, stories are actually often not considered as powerful as much as, I'm a predominantly qualitative researcher, so that is not great to realize, but people can find ways to dehumanize stories, even when you present it in ways that you think are compelling. And that's where the big numbers, I suppose, come in. And there are ways to disaggregate data and analyze data in an intersectional way. But I think we do fall into a trap of sometimes doing that in an additive way. So not necessarily looking at how those different variables, for lack of a better word, contribute to an amplified kind of experience. So I think I would have to point you to those resources. I wouldn't be able to do it justice. Like I said, I am a predominantly qualitative researcher, but I think we need to rise to that challenge of injecting this complexity into data sets. There was a call for an intersectional framework to be intentionally integrated into how we collect data on SDGs. But I think I'll make one last point, and sorry, it doesn't answer your question, it's just related, but I think it is important. We also don't consider the capacity of countries to collect data, or even the political will to prioritize gender data. So if you look at, we have, I think something like 30% of gender data in terms of the SDGs actually gets consistently reported on by countries. So I'm not saying that we therefore should not insist on an intersectional approach. I think we should, and we should also consider how capacity can be strengthened and governments can be held accountable to collecting that data, because that's ultimately what we do end up using for advocacy. We enter those spaces and we know that we also need the big data, not just, we need the stories and we need the big data. It's not one at the expense of the other.
Thanks, Ingrid, and to Nirvana. I think for me, I'll just try to answer this, because from the perspective of an economist who, oftentimes, we deal with, when we're asking these types of questions, we deal with whether or not even that is even considered economics, because of this prioritization, or a lot of this emphasis on the mathematical or quantitative side of this. And I think, one of the issues that you raise, Ingrid, was, how it's been approached is this additive question, the qualitative side. I think one thing that we need to ask ourselves, are the numbers enough to actually show, the reality of what is being experienced? And if they're not, I think it's like the difference between gender political economy approaches and feminist economics approaches, where it's not just saying, okay, I'm just going to add now this additional variable, but to actually say, well, maybe we need to come up with, more radical approaches, and maybe new approaches, and ways of even collecting that data. So some of that, initially at initial stages, when we're trying to kind of start this process, might not necessarily be that it's going to be kind of representative, but it is to show, the things that have been ignored, right? And to reveal these issues of kind of power and inequality. And I think what that requires then is having more mixed methods approaches, but also, I think, as you've mentioned, not kind of undermining the power of qualitative approaches, even, as we kind of look into these new ways of trying to develop research that will inform policy. And then I think to hand over then to Prof. Lebo and Dr. Lisa Weaversick there, the two questions about how do we tackle the dominance of these kind of international theories, or the universalization of Northern theories on this as global South feminists. And then I see a follow-up to that from Debarati Chowdhury is asking, kind of like it's important to include intersectional approaches in ways that goes with kind of decolonial feminist research practices as well. So how do we do that while also disrupting, I think, from the kind of the decolonial side of this?
Lisa, you want to take a first step?
I think that so to touch on the feminist on sort of decolonial feminist research and feminist post-colonial theory, I think that when you read those theorists' work, so like Mohanty and Nayaran and Spivak, I think that a lot of if you read intersectionality literature and you read those, there are a lot of parallels. I think that feminist post-colonial theorists have been looking at issues more intersectionally for a long time now, and the two work really, really well together. And we're in a former colony and with our history of apartheid, I think all research should have something to say, should be located in some way in decolonial or post-colonial thinking anyway. But yeah, I think that the two approaches are really closely aligned. And yeah, also with how to tackle the universalism, I think we should continue to do good work. And also, I think that we should push back. And I think that we should expect more, not just from our colleagues in the global north, but also from funders. We should expect them to embrace a different way of thinking about the people and the people with whom and places in which they work.
Prof. Lebu, do you have anything to add?
I think I'm covered.
Okay, I see Jocelyn's hand back up again. Sorry, Jocelyn.
Yes, my apologies. I was somehow thrown out of the seminar earlier on. I'm rather confused. Firstly, because when I signed up for the seminar, I thought to myself, I need to understand what does intersectionality means. And I mean, a little bit of what I get is that my apologies, there's some noise going on here in my office. The focus on feminism, and as a woman myself, I mean, I didn't look at intersectionality as a feminist issue. But I may be wrong, because when I think about intersectionality, and especially with regards to research and developmental work, in the apartheid struggle days, methods in terms of working developmental methods that NGOs used to use in terms of finding out and working through communities through what they're going through, issues of oppression and exploitation, were done in participatory qualitative ways, where you work with communities and figuring out what's going on. Partly because of the importance of interacting with people themselves and finding out what's going on with their lives, but also because of the gap in formal and official statistics about the lives of Black people through a lack of census information, household survey information, et cetera, et cetera. And so in the post-apartheid democratic period, the ability then to start including people's life experiences in censuses, in surveys, and you would have seen the progress in how we framed official statistics, that we move from a household survey to a labor force survey. We have a health and demographic survey, especially during the days of HIV/AIDS research, et cetera, et cetera. So the official statistical measurement of people's lives were both about, one, more rigor, secondly, about inclusivity, about Black people, Black women, et cetera, their life experiences throughout society or throughout the South African economy. And then we have various other things around firm service and so on and so forth. So for a developing economy, I must say that when I look at data, and I'm worried that we are making distinction between quantitative work generating data and perhaps not so much qualitative research, because I see these two as complementing. So the point that I was trying to make is that when one looks at intersectionality at a contextual level in South Africa, the role of quantitative survey data has been about building intersectionality, has been about finding out what is going on with Black people's lives, what is going on with women's lives, what's going on with Indian men's life, et cetera, et cetera. Now, if we were to see that just in the northern way of we having this big picture, then I think we're wrong. Then we are actually imposing our own northern attitudes to data that's being generated in a developing economy. Then when one also looks at the development of these tools, we now have panel surveys that actually look, the labor force survey has a panel survey which actually tracks 30% of the survey participants throughout. We've got a national income dynamic survey. There's also, it's a panel survey, so you're also tracking the lives of people. So what I'm saying is that if we start labeling in the context of South Africa, saying that there is less value to be derived on issues of intersectionality from quantitative data, then I think we're missing the point, because this is really where, I mean, for instance, there's one big thing about South Africa, one conclusion that you can come to. After 30 years of democracy, the profile of the poorest, most marginalized, and most vulnerable person in South Africa is the African woman, is the African female. And she's generally between the ages of 15 and 29 years old. That is the most vulnerable. Now, no qualitative survey, qualitative study, of course, can intervene on that issue, but it is a census, it's a survey, it's survey data that actually brings about that. We can do analysis. So for me, the issue of quantitative data is not so much about this positivism, whatever thing. It's about how does the analyst approach that data? Because you can develop stories. And I love the term that I think the last speaker used, the issue of stories. If you take a panel survey data, you can really develop a story about what is happening to a colored woman in Mitchell's Plain, because we now have data by district. In Mitchell's Plain, over the last 10 years of her life post-school, you can figure out the story of that person. So I'm saying for a developing economy, we don't have the kind of resources to do massive numbers of smaller studies. At least the survey data does give us a starting point from which to begin to make major conclusions and get major insights about what's happening to particular people. And if the analysts take the right approach, you can actually figure out that intersectional story. So for me, I'm not against qualitative research, but I'm saying that for me is an added picture. We just do not have the resources to do that. And therefore, I'm not saying that there's no value, but I'm saying don't reject or dismiss the value of quantitative data. Thank you.
Thanks, Jocelyn. Sorry, I would like to give an opportunity to the speakers to respond if you have any responses. I am aware that we're a little over time now, but if any of you would like to just respond to the final point that Jocelyn was making there.
I can say that I think Jocelyn answered the question that she started with quite clearly, actually, that it is about the analyst. So I don't think everyone is skilled at pulling together that more complicated, almost not complicated, complex story from quantitative data, but it's very possible. And I think there are people doing that quite skillfully. It's really about people building their capacity in analyzing data in that way. And I think I used the word confidence earlier because I think that's part of it, building their confidence in treating quantitative data in a way where you can weave together a story.
It's also about, sorry, through you. It's also about the questions that you ask. So it's not, today I will use quantitative, is about what questions am I asking and what's the best methods to answer the questions that I'm asking.
And then
so
also,
she's very correct. We can't throw away the method before we know what questions we are asking.
And to add to Ingrid and Lebo, if we're thinking intersectionality when we are developing our research questions and how we are asking those questions, then we will be able to analyze the data generated to respond to those questions in an intersectional way, whether it be quantitative or qualitative.
Okay, with that, then I think we can close off this session. I think, our last speaker in the Q&A has raised, an important point in saying that there has been a lot of progress that has happened in kind of the post-apartheid period in developing these new tools. I think what the panelists have all showed is that there's still a long way to go, and some of that is kind of given the kind of the systems in which we're operating in this international development space. But as Prof. Lebo just added there, it's about asking the right questions that are based on the context in which we are working in, that we're living in. And I think this is a point that all of the speakers have shown today with the presentations, an opportunity that kind of intersectionality brings into development research. But thank you all for your time. Sorry, a little bit over, but we will be in touch with the following sessions. Thanks to the speakers as well.